Hi, I'm Carl Franklin. In the last episode of Blazor Train, I showed you how to do basic authentication and authorization in a Blazor server application. In this episode, I'll show you how to do it in a Blazor WebAssembly application. I'll be using the Microsoft ASP.NET Identity subsystem, which uses a SQL database for user data, but we're going to add support for roles in our code. Now, there's a little bit of plumbing, but the component markup in code is exactly the same. And guess what? That's all coming up right now, right here on Blazor Train. All right, so as usual, everything that I'm going to show you today is in a public repo at GitHub. It's github.com/carlfranklin/basic-auth-wasm. So you can follow along here if you like. Before we get started, a couple of definitions. Authentication is the process of confirming that a user is the person that they say they are, and the user is generally represented by an identity. Authorization is different. Now that we know the user's identity, what are we going to allow them to do? Authorization is allowing the user to access aspects of your application based on their identity and the roles or claims they present. A role is simply a name like admin, supervisor, or content manager. You can assign users to one or more roles and then check those roles at runtime to authorize the user to do or see an aspect of the application. We're going to use roles in this episode. Claims are a little different. A claim is an assertion by the user, such as their name or email address. It can also be very specific to an aspect of the application, such as Ken click the counter button. A claim is like a role, but more specific to the action they want to perform or the aspect they want to access. Claims are being favored over roles, but role-based authentication is still very useful and very powerful. So there are many ways to do authentication and authorization in a Blazor WebAssembly application. We're going to use the Microsoft ASP.NET Identity subsystem, including support for roles. The Blazor WebAssembly template gives us everything we need to generate an identity database, which uses a standard schema used by the Microsoft ASP.NET Identity subsystem. Well, almost everything. We're going to create a new Blazor WebAssembly application in which we will allow users to register. We can then authorize sections of markup, entire pages, and even code based on whether or not the user is authenticated and what roles they are in. So to get started, we're going to create a new Blazor WebAssembly app, and I'm going to call it Basic-Auth-Wasm. Now it's going to be a .NET 7 application, and we're going to select individual accounts as the authentication type and also ASP.NET Core hosted. Now, I must point out the README that comes up right away. The code includes a dependency on Duende Identity Server. This is an open source product with a reciprocal license agreement, and if you plan to use it in production, you may have to get a license. And then there's a couple of sentences with links to using Azure Active Directory or getting a commercial license from Duende Identity Server. So the first thing let's do is look in app settings JSON in the server project. Now right here, we've got our identity database connection string, which was generated for us. Take a look. The database name is ASP.NET-Basic-Auth-Wasm, which is the name of our project, .server, and then some GUID string, which is generated on the fly, and it's guaranteed to be unique in the world. But I want to make this easy, so I'm going to take out all this gobbledygook and just make the database name Basic-Auth-Wasm. Now, if you look at the SQL Server Object Explorer, and we go down here to local DB and expand the databases, I've got a couple of databases that I've created before, including one that I created for the last episode, episode 26, Basic Auth. But the database that we've defined hasn't been created yet. To do that, we're going to open the Package Manager console and enter update-database. Done. Now, how did all that magic happen? In the server app, you look under Areas, Identity, and Pages, and there's some shared pages here, a login partial, but also under Data, if you look at Migrations, you've got these files here. Create Identity Schema. That migration is what gets executed when you issue that update database command. And there's already a DB context there for us. And if you look in models, there's an application user. So all of the GUI required to do authentication is built into the template. All you have to do is issue that update database command after setting the name of the database. So now let's go back and look at the databases and refresh. And you can see basic Auth is there now. And if I expand the tables, this is what we have. We're going to be using ASP.NET users, ASP.NET roles, and ASP.NET user roles, which links the two. Next, we need to add support for roles. So I'm going to start on the client by adding a class called Custom User Factory. Now this class is in the repo. You can just copy and paste it. And you might be asking yourself, well, why do I need to do this? Shouldn't this be built in? Well, no. Support for roles is not built into the template, and we have to configure it both on the client and on the server. Now this right here, this Custom User Factory, is going to be used when we access the token from the API. If you look in controllers here, there's an OIDC configuration controller. And this guy is going to, right here, create a claims principal that includes support for role claims. Now, that's not all on the client. If you go to Program, we have to tell the app to use that Custom User Factory to generate the claims principal. So we're going to replace line 16 with this: Add Account Claims Principal Factory, Custom User Factory. And that's all we have to do on the client. Now on the server project, we got to open up Program CS here, and I'm just going to replace it with all the stuff that we need. Right here, when we added the default identity, we inserted this little guy, add roles of identity role. And we replaced the call to add identity server with one that adds the resources for the claims, the name claim and the role claim. All right, at this point, we can run it and see what we get. Well, it looks just like a regular Blazor hosted WebAssembly app, but there's a few things that are different. We can go to counter, we can increment the counter, but what if we go to fetch data? Okay. It wants us to log in. Well, we don't really have an account yet, but let me show you why it wants us to log in. Looking at the fetch data Razor page, we have this attribute right here, authorize. And that basically, just like in a web API, this basically says the user cannot access this page unless they're logged in. Now, these two using statements right here, I want to move those to imports, _imports, because we're going to need those in other places. All right, so let's run it again. And this time we're going to register ourselves. So we're going to click register. And I'm just going to use my email address, or one of my email addresses, and a simple password that I can remember. Now, this is very important. At this point, if you had an email sender registered with two-factor authentication or anything like that, it would kick in, but we don't have that right out of the box. And here's what's going to happen when I click here to confirm my account. If we look in users, let's view the data and look here, you can see email confirmed is false for my user. Now I'm going to click to confirm my account, and let's go look again, refresh. And now email confirmed is true. So now I can log in. Okay. After all that hullabaloo, I can view the home page. I can view the counter page, and I can view the fetch data page. Now, the fetch data page allowed me to see it because I'm logged in. But now we can add some more rules based on roles. Let's go to the nav menu, and I'm going to encase this nav link here, the entire div, in an authorized view component. And what that says is, hey, don't even show this nav link unless the user is logged in. And you can use authorized view around any markup, anywhere in Blazor, to restrict that markup to only be shown if the user is logged in. Now here's another trick. For fetch data, I'm going to require that the user is not only logged in, but is in the role of admin in order to see this nav link. Okay? Now watch what happens. Okay, I'm not logged in, so I can't see counter or fetch data. But look, I can actually navigate to counter with the URL. And I can use it no problem because I only restricted access to the nav link, right? Now, I can't go to fetch data. See? That's because of this. We have to be logged in to see fetch data. Okay, but I limited this link to only show the link if I'm in the admin role. How do I do that on the page itself? Like this. I'm going to use the same authorize attribute, but now I've specified roles equals admin. And that's a comma-separated list of roles that have access to see this page. Now let's secure the counter page. So I'll go to the counter page, and I'm going to require that the user be logged in, but not in any special role. All right, let's try it again. All right, so I'll log in again. Now we can see counter. We can use the counter. We don't see fetch data. And if I navigate to fetch data, we're going to get this message. You are not authorized to access this resource. And that's because we're not in the admin role. So let's put my user in the admin role. To do that, I'm going to use another repo that I created, Identity Manager Library. And this includes not only the library, which is a .NET standard library for managing roles of users and also adding and removing users, but also a Blazor server application that uses the library to manage the roles. Then there's another app called Auth Demo, which is a Blazor server project that has the authorization tags and things that I'm showing you here. So all you got to do is download the zip file, unpack it, and load it up in Visual Studio. And here it is. Now, I also used this in the last episode, 26, and I had set the database to basic auth, which was the Blazor server version. I'm going to change that database name in app settings JSON to basic auth WASM, so it's looking at the right database, and we'll run it. So here you go. If we look at users, here's my user, but there's no roles. So let's look at roles. There are none defined, so we'll create a new one called admin. Save it. Boom, done. Now we can go back to users and edit my user and say, I want this user to be in the admin role, and save it. I'm just going to minimize this because we're going to come back to it. Back in our demo, I'll run it again and log in. And now I'm in the admin role, so I can actually see the link to fetch data. And when I go there, I get to see it because I'm in the admin role. So not only are we authorizing this markup over here, but we're authorizing the entire page with that attribute. Now this is all cool, but what if I want to examine the user with code to see if they're in a particular role or if they're even authenticated. Like, what if I wanted to authorize clicking the counter and create a role just for being able to click the counter? Let's do that. I'm going to replace the entire counter page with this. Now I have the attribute, authorize attribute right there. And I've just added a little markup for this error message. And the error message is a string. Now I've added a couple of things. This cascading parameter of authentication state. Well, cascading parameters, if you know anything about Blazor, they have to be set up in app.razor. So if you go to app.razor, guess what? The entire router is encased in a cascading authentication state. And that means I can grab a task of authentication state as a cascading parameter. Now I've also got a claims principal here called user, and that's what we're actually going to pull out of this authentication state. We're going to do that down here on initialized async. So if authentication state is not null, we're going to await it because it's a task, remember? And then we're going to pull out that claims principal, auth state user. Now in increment count, I'm going to set the error message to an empty string, and I'm going to check to see if the user is null, and if it is, return. But that should never happen because we have that authorize attribute at the top. Next, I'm checking to see if the user is not authenticated. Also should never happen because of the authentication requirement of this page. But I wanted to show you how you can check to see if the user is authenticated. And then we're checking to see if the user is in the counter clicker role, just a name I made up. And if the user is in that role, then I increment the count. Otherwise, I say, you do not have permission to increment the counter. So before we create this role, let's run it and make sure that the authorization works. Logging in. Okay, fetch data should work, no problem. Go to counter, we can go to the page because there's no role-based authorization to view the page. But when I click, I do not have permission to increment the counter. What do I need for that? Well, Identity Manager. Let's create a new role called Counter Clicker. Save it. Go back to my users, edit, put my user in the Counter Clicker role, and save it. And now I can log out of my app and log back in again. And now I can increment the counter. Woohoo! So to summarize, we created a new Blazor hosted WebAssembly project with basic individual accounts identity-based authentication. We added a custom claims principal class so we can access roles on the client. On the server, we added support for identity roles in Program CS. We also added support for Identity Server to handle roles. We modified the identity database connection string in app settings JSON. We generated the identity database with the update database command. We ran the app and registered as a new user. We authorized markup in nav menu razor. And we authorized the counter razor and fetch data razor pages. We also used the Identity Manager Blazor server app to add roles and assign them. And we authorized access to code using a claims principal object that represents the user. And that's my demo. Now back to you in the studio, Carl. You know, there are many ways to do auth in a Blazor WebAssembly app as outlined in the documentation. For a standalone WebAssembly app, you can use the authentication library, Microsoft accounts, Azure Active Directory or AAD, and AAD B2C. For a hosted WebAssembly app, you can use AAD, AAD B2C, or Identity Server, which is what Carl just showed you. According to Jeremy Lickness, in .NET 8, Microsoft is introducing some new tech around auth in Blazor WebAssembly apps. Here's Jeremy.
Authentication and authorization have been a top of the list priority for a lot of developers, the top voted list in the ASP.NET repo for specific scenarios. So when we talk about ways that you can authenticate and authorize your app, there are things that you can install locally. There are managed services. There are products. So there's a variety of ways. And so the scenario that we focused on for .NET 8 is what we call self-host. So this is where someone is hosting a site. They need login security, but they don't necessarily need to do things like call a web API with special security that's in a third-party system or grant access to an external system. These things require more complicated flows, but if it's just my users, my system, we call that self-host, and that's what the ASP.NET Core Identity System services. It gives you a self-host way of managing identities. And so what we focused on was a couple things. The single-page app experience, so when you're doing like Angular, JavaScript, or Blazor WebAssembly, for example, that experience was not the greatest experience because the screens that let you manage your identity experience, change your password, set up two-factor authentication, were all server rendered. So you went out of your, oh, this is my snappy single-page application to here's an old style server rendered experience and bounce back and forth. So to address that, we are exposing a set of APIs that people were hacking together themselves, but now we're giving them out of the box so that you can call an endpoint and do things like log in. And we're giving you the safest default option for when you're self-hosting, which is a cookie, because it's ambient, so to speak, right? So that cookie, once it's set, is automatically set in the header of the browser. You don't have to do anything as a developer. But the reality is there are clients, like some people will have this application stood up and they want a mobile client to access it. And a mobile client doesn't, if it's not running a browser, doesn't have a cookie management solution, right? So then we go to tokens. So we're providing tokens, but the important thing for people to understand is this is the easy, I'm setting up an app, it's a local app. We're trying to make that experience as easy as possible. If you get to the level that you need to start interfacing with multiple systems, etc., then you want to look at something like Azure AD, right, which is our offering for that, or something that we had before that was installed on premise, which is called Identity Server, which is a OAuth OIDC. It's a set of technology related to authentication and authorization, but it gives you management of more complex flows with that. So we're not trying to be a security provider and provide that full-blown solution, but we do recognize we have a huge number of developers who have those isolated apps that just want to experience that they can feel secure without having the overhead of configuring like a full-blown OIDC server, etc.
Thanks, Jeremy. You know, once .NET 8 comes out, I'll add a link to a new episode focused on the new stuff. Until then, we can do things the .NET 7 way. Hey, thanks for riding the rails with me today. This is where I jump off. I'll see you next time.
Blaze a train!